Imagine a continent so ancient, so impossibly vast, that standing at its heart feels less like standing on Earth and more like standing on another planet entirely. A land where deserts swallow horizons whole, where coral kingdoms stretch for over 2,000 kilometers beneath warm tropical seas, where creatures exist that seem designed by a dreamer with no regard for the rules of biology. A place where indigenous voices have been singing the same sacred songs for 65,000 years, making them the oldest continuous cultural tradition on the face of this earth. Welcome to Australia. And nothing you have ever seen, read, or imagined has fully prepared you for this. Australia is not simply a country. It is a continent unto itself, the sixth largest landmass on the planet, stretching nearly 4,000 kilometers from its northern tropical tip to its southern temperate shores, and nearly the same distance from its sun-scorched western coast to the ancient forested ranges of the east. It covers nearly 7.5 million square kilometers, meaning you could fit the entire continental United States inside it and still have room left over. Yet despite all that space, all that wild and extraordinary terrain, fewer than 27 million people call it home. Most of them live pressed against the coastline, as if quietly agreeing to leave the vast, pulsing interior to the land itself. And what an interior it is! To understand Australia, you have to first appreciate its age. This is one of the oldest landmasses on Earth, a fragment of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana that began breaking apart around 180 million years ago. When the tectonic plates shifted and the continents drifted to their modern positions, Australia rode away in geological isolation, carrying its passengers with it. Plants, animals, and eventually people evolved here in a world apart, producing a caste of living creatures found absolutely nowhere else on the planet. Roughly 80% of Australia's animals are endemic, meaning they exist here and here alone. The result is a natural world so singular, so fantastically different from the rest of the globe, that early European explorers simply could not believe what they were seeing. A mammal with a beaver's tail, an otter's body, and a duck's bill that laid eggs? Scientists in England initially suspected a hoax when the first platypus specimen arrived. They were wrong, of course. Australia simply plays by different rules. The story of Australia's human history is equally extraordinary, and equally humbling. The First Nations peoples of Australia arrived on this continent at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier, making them the oldest known continuous civilization in human history. Think about that for a moment. When ancient Egypt was still thousands of years away from laying the first stone of its first pyramid, when the great empires of Mesopotamia had not yet drawn breath, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were already here, already singing this land into existence through their songlines, already living in deep, sophisticated relationship with every river, every rock shelf, every shifting season of this ancient country. Their knowledge of the land, its plants, its animals, its waterways and weather patterns, represents one of the most complex and enduring systems of ecological understanding ever developed by human beings. It is a legacy that deserves far more than a footnote. It is the very foundation of everything Australia is. European contact with this continent came much later, and its consequences were devastating for those who had called it home for tens of thousands of years. Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon made the first recorded European landing in 1606, touching the western edge of Cape York Peninsula in what is now Queensland. Other Dutch and Portuguese navigators followed, charting fragments of the coastline and naming the landmass New Holland. But it was the arrival of British explorer Captain James Cook in 1770, sailing the eastern coast aboard the Endeavour and claiming the land for the British Crown, that changed everything. 18 years later, the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove, carrying over 750 convicts and their military guards, planting the flag of a new colonial settlement on the shores of a country that was already ancient, already inhabited, already deeply known. The violence, the dispossession, and the cultural destruction that followed cast a long shadow that Australia is still, honestly and courageously, working to reckon with today. And yet from all of that complicated, painful, and remarkable history, something extraordinary emerged. A nation that today stands as one of the most multicultural societies on Earth, a place where over 300 languages are spoken, where people from more than 200 countries have made their homes beside one another and alongside the world's oldest living cultures. Australians are famously warm, irreverent, and possessed of a national self-deprecating humor that puts almost every other culture to shame. They will offer you a cold beer and take the mickey out of you within 5 minutes of meeting you, and somehow you will love them for it immediately. The phrase "she'll be right," meaning roughly that everything will work out fine, captures something essential about the Australian spirit: a bone-deep optimism, a practical resilience born from generations of living with a land that demands respect and offers extraordinary rewards in return. Speaking of rewards, Australia offers them in staggering variety. Its landscapes range from the otherworldly red sandstone formations of the Outback, to the lush, dripping rainforests of Queensland's Daintree, which at 135 million years old is the oldest tropical rainforest on the planet. Its coastline stretches for over 34,000 kilometers, offering everything from the famous golden surf beaches of the East Coast to the dramatically remote cliffs and bays of the wild South. Its cities pulse with life, creativity, and culinary brilliance, regularly appearing among the world's most livable urban environments. And hovering above it all, the sky. Australians will tell you, and they are not wrong, that the sky here is different. Bigger somehow. Bluer. At night, far from the city lights, the southern hemisphere reveals constellations that northern eyes have never learned to read, and the Milky Way pours across the darkness in a river of silver light so bright it casts faint shadows on the ground. Australia is a country of superlatives and contradictions, of breathtaking beauty and sobering history, of ancient silence and vibrant modern energy. It is the driest inhabited continent on Earth, yet it contains some of the most biodiverse marine environments anywhere on the planet. It is home to 17 of the world's 20 most venomous snakes, yet its people swim, hike, and camp in the wild with cheerful confidence. It is vast enough to feel empty, and yet intimate enough to feel, almost immediately, like home. Over the course of this journey, we are going to travel from the shimmering tropical north to the windswept southern coasts, from the neon skylines of its great cities to the deep red silence at the very center of this ancient, breathing land. We are going to discover the wonders that make Australia unlike any other place on this earth. And we begin exactly where this land begins its most dramatic story, with the great natural icons that have become symbols not just of a nation, but of the wild, irreducible power of the natural world itself. There is a moment, when you first see Uluru rising from the flat red desert plain, when your brain simply refuses to process what your eyes are telling it. Nothing in your experience has prepared you for this. No photograph, no film, no description in any language quite captures the sheer physical shock of it. One moment there is nothing but the endless, ancient flatness of the Australian outback stretching to every horizon. And then, impossibly, monstrously, magnificently, there it is. A single sandstone monolith standing 348 meters above the surrounding plain, nearly 10 kilometers in circumference at its base, and so old that the rock itself was formed approximately 500 million years ago. It does not look like it belongs to this planet. It looks like something the Earth dreamed and then pushed up through the ground in a single, slow, geological breath. But Uluru is far more than a geological spectacle. For the Anango people, the traditional custodians of this land, this rock is one of the most sacred places in the world. Every cave, every fissure, every ancient watermark carved into its surface tells a story that stretches back tens of thousands of years. The Chukurpa, the Anango system of law, spirituality, and knowledge, is woven into the very fabric of this stone. Ceremonies were performed here. Stories were taught here. Lives began and ended in the shadow of this monolith. When the Australian government returned full ownership of Uluru and the surrounding Kata Tjuta National Park to the Anango people in 1985, it was a recognition not just of land rights, but of an unbroken human relationship with a place that makes most of recorded history look like a footnote. What makes Uluru endlessly fascinating to scientists as well is that the rock you see above the surface is only a fraction of the whole. The formation extends deep underground, estimated to reach down more than 5 kilometers into the earth. And the colors that wash across its surface throughout the day are not a trick of light. They are the result of iron oxide within the sandstone reacting to different wavelengths of sunlight at different angles. At dawn, it blushes a delicate rose. By midday it burns an almost violet orange. At sunset, just before darkness swallows it whole, it turns a purple so deep and rich it looks almost supernatural. Watching this transformation, sitting on the red earth with the desert air cooling rapidly around you as the stars begin to appear overhead, you feel something that is difficult to put into words. A sense of your own smallness. A sense of time moving at a scale that human language was never quite designed to describe. Just 50 kilometers to the west of Uluru sits its magnificent companion, Kata Tjuta. While Uluru is one, Kata Tjuta is many. The name means many heads in the Ananga language, and that is precisely what you see. 36 domed rock formations rising dramatically from the desert floor, the tallest of which, Mount Olga, stands nearly 200 meters higher than Uluru itself. Walking through the Valley of the Winds, one of the trails that winds between these ancient domes, you feel enclosed by geology in a way that is both humbling and strangely intimate. The rock walls lean in around you. The desert wind funnels through the narrow passages. And overhead, the sky is reduced to a narrow ribbon of blue between formations that have been standing here since long before humans walked this continent. But Australia's natural wonders do not belong only to the dry interior. Travel north and east, and the landscape transforms in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The red earth gives way to tropical green. The dry desert air thickens with humidity. And then the coastline of Queensland appears, and with it, one of the greatest natural structures ever assembled on this planet. The Great Barrier Reef stretches for over 2,300 kilometers along the northeastern coast of Australia, making it the largest coral reef system on Earth and the only living structure visible from outer space. Let that fact sit with you for a moment. Something built by tiny living organisms, by coral polyps no larger than your fingernail, is large enough to be seen from the International Space Station. It is home to over 1,500 species of fish, 4,000 types of mollusk, 240 species of birds, and 30 species of whales and dolphins. 6 of the world's 7 species of marine turtles swim these waters. Humpback whales travel from Antarctica to give birth in its warm, sheltered bays. And beneath the surface, in a world of staggering, almost hallucinatory color, an entire civilization of life carries on in quiet, ancient, extraordinary abundance. The reef began forming approximately 20 million years ago, though its current structure is thought to be around 6,000 to 8,000 years old, shaped by rising sea levels after the last ice age. It is, in every sense of the word, alive. And like all living things, it is vulnerable. Rising ocean temperatures have caused significant coral bleaching events in recent decades, a phenomenon that occurs when corals are stressed by heat and expel the algae living in their tissues, turning white and, if the stress continues, dying. Scientists, conservationists, and the Australian government are engaged in urgent, innovative work to protect and restore this irreplaceable wonder. The story of the Great Barrier Reef is not just a story of natural splendor. It is a story of our relationship with the natural world and the responsibility that comes with sharing this planet. Along the southern edge of the continent, a very different kind of geological drama is playing out. The Great Ocean Road in Victoria is one of the most scenic coastal drives anywhere on Earth, a ribbon of asphalt carved into the cliffs and headlands by returning soldiers after the First World War, dedicated as a living memorial to those who did not come home. And at its most famous point, rising from the churning Southern Ocean in defiance of every wave that crashes against them, stand the 12 Apostles. These towering limestone stacks, some reaching heights of 45 meters, were formed over millions of years as the relentless Southern Ocean eroded the soft limestone coastline, creating caves that collapsed into arches, and arches that eventually fell away to leave these solitary pillars standing in the surf. There were never actually 12 of them. At their peak there were 9, and today only 8 remain standing. The ocean continues its patient, unstoppable work, and geologists predict that these remaining stacks will eventually fall too. But for now, standing on the clifftop platform with the Southern Ocean wind tearing at your jacket and the spray rising in great white curtains from the rocks below, the sight is nothing less than electrifying. This is a coastline in the act of becoming. A landscape that is changing before your very eyes, even if the pace of that change is measured in centuries rather than seconds. Australia's capacity for wonder does not end where the wilderness begins. Because woven into the landscape of this extraordinary country are cities of equal beauty and ambition, places where human creativity has found a setting dramatic enough to match it. And nowhere is that more magnificently on display than along the sparkling waters of Sydney Harbour, where one of the most iconic skylines on the face of the earth awaits our arrival. But Australia has a way of rewarding those who look beyond the obvious, beyond the postcards and the headline attractions, to the quieter places, the stranger corners, the destinations that do not shout for attention but simply wait, patient and unhurried, for the traveler curious enough to find them. This is a country so vast, so layered with geological drama and human history, that its most celebrated landmarks represent only the faintest outline of what is actually here. Scratch beneath the surface, and an entirely different Australia begins to reveal itself. In the heart of South Australia, the Flinders Ranges rise from the red earth like the bones of some primordial creature, folded and compressed by forces almost beyond imagination. These mountains are among the oldest exposed rock formations on the surface of the planet, some layers dating back more than 500 million years. The centerpiece of this ancient landscape is Wilpena Pound, a vast natural amphitheater enclosed by walls of quartzite ridges, roughly 8 kilometers wide and 16 kilometers long. Seen from the air, it resembles the crater of a volcano, though it was formed by something far more patient, the slow buckling of the Earth's crust over hundreds of millions of years. The Adnyamathanha people, the traditional custodians of this land, have lived in relationship with the pound for at least 40,000 years. In their stories, the circular ridge is the body of two great serpents who feasted so abundantly on a ceremony held inside that they could not move, their entwined forms becoming the very rock that now defines the horizon. Standing at the rim and looking down into that immense bowl of silence, it is not difficult to believe them. The wildlife of the Flinders Ranges carries its own quiet magic. Yellow-footed rock wallabies pick their way across vertical cliff faces with almost comical ease, their spectacularly striped tails acting as counterweights to their impossible agility. Wedge-tailed eagles drift on thermals so high above the ridgelines they become mere specks against an impossibly blue sky, surveying a kingdom measured not in acres but in geological ages. Travel to the far west of South Australia and you will find yourself at the edge of something that seems to belong to a different planet entirely. Lake Hillier sits on the edge of Middle Island in the Recherche archipelago, a stretch of water that looks, at first glance, like someone has poured an enormous quantity of raspberry cordial into the earth. The lake is a vivid, almost luminous pink, not the dusty blush of a sunset but a saturated, confident, unambiguous pink that makes viewers routinely question whether what they are seeing has been digitally altered. It has not. Scientists believe the color is produced by a combination of algae, halobacteria, and high salt concentrations, though the precise chemistry is still being studied. What is certain is that the color does not disappear when you dip your hand into the water. The water itself runs pink between your fingers. And because Lake Hillier is bounded by a narrow strip of white sand and surrounded by the deep green of dense eucalyptus forest, with the deep blue of the Southern Ocean just beyond, the visual effect is one of almost surreal beauty, a landscape arranged by an artist with a particularly bold sense of color theory. Beyond the obvious wilderness, Australia conceals its wonders even underground. The Waitomo glowworm caves in New Zealand may draw the famous comparisons, but Australia's own Jenolan Caves in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales contain some of the oldest cave systems open to the public anywhere on Earth. And yet the more extraordinary underground experience may be found further north, beneath the rainforest of the Atherton Tablelands in Queensland, where the Undara lava tubes stretch for nearly 160 kilometers, forming one of the longest lava tube systems in the world. Created roughly 190,000 years ago when a massive shield volcano erupted and the outer skin of lava flows hardened while molten rock continued to drain through the center, these tunnels are cathedrals of raw geology. Inside, the walls and ceilings retain the fluid, almost sculptural lines of ancient movement, rippled and grooved as if the stone itself remembers being liquid. For those who chase stars rather than caves, the Australian outback offers something that is becoming increasingly rare in the modern world: genuine darkness. Far from the light pollution of the coastal cities, under skies that stretch without interruption from one horizon to the other, the Milky Way does not simply appear as a faint smudge but as a blazing river of light, dense enough to cast a shadow on clear nights. The town of Coonabarabran in central New South Wales is known as the astronomy capital of Australia, home to the country's largest optical telescope at the Siding Spring Observatory. But you do not need a telescope to be astonished. Simply lying on your back on the red earth and looking up is enough to produce that particular, vertiginous sensation of understanding, just for a moment, exactly how small and how fortunate you are. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, the horizontal falls present one of the most peculiar hydrological spectacles on the continent. Tidal movements force billions of liters of seawater through two narrow gorges in the McClarty Range at such velocity that the water level on one side of each gap can be up to 4 meters higher than the other, creating what appears to be a waterfall running sideways. The late David Attenborough described the phenomenon as one of the greatest natural wonders he had ever seen, which on a list that includes nearly the entire remarkable surface of this planet, is saying something considerable. The Whitsunday Islands, scattered like jade and emerald fragments across the Coral Sea, hold within them one beach so perfect it has become almost embarrassing to describe. Whitehaven Beach stretches for 7 kilometers and is composed of 98% pure silica sand, a material so fine and so white that it does not retain heat in the way ordinary beach sand does. Even on a blazing summer afternoon, you can walk barefoot without discomfort. The swirling tidal patterns at Hill Inlet, where the pure white sand mixes with the shifting blues and greens of the tidal waters in constantly changing patterns, produce a view that photographers have described as impossible to capture adequately, because no image fully conveys the sense that you are standing at the edge of something that has been arranged specifically to make you feel grateful for the simple fact of being alive and present in this moment. These hidden corners, these quieter wonders, are part of what makes Australia so endlessly surprising. A country that continues to offer revelation to those who seek it, from the depths of its ancient caves to the burning clarity of its night skies. And yet alongside these natural treasures, Australia has also built something remarkable, a culture forged at the meeting point of some of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth and waves of new arrivals who brought their stories, their food, their languages, and their art to an already extraordinary place. But perhaps nothing stops a first-time visitor in their tracks quite like the moment they realize the animals here are genuinely, wonderfully, almost impossibly different from anything else on Earth. Australia did not simply evolve a few unusual creatures. It became, over tens of millions of years of glorious isolation, an entirely separate experiment in what life could become. And the results are breathtaking. When the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana broke apart and the landmass that would become Australia drifted northward alone, it took its passengers with it. Cut off from the rest of the world's evolutionary pressures, Australia's animals developed along their own extraordinary lines. The result is a continent where pouched mammals raise their young in ways that seem almost miraculous, where egg-laying mammals exist that confounded scientists so completely when first described that European zoologists refused to believe the specimens were real, and where birds have developed behaviors so intelligent and so strange that they continue to astonish researchers today. The kangaroo has become the symbol of this nation, and rightly so. There is something almost surreal about watching a large red kangaroo move at full speed across the open outback. That effortless bounding gait, those enormous muscled haunches, that long thick tail acting as a counterbalance and a fifth limb all at once. Australia is home to more than 60 species of kangaroos and wallabies, ranging from the towering red kangaroo, the largest marsupial on Earth, to the tiny thumbnail-sized joey that emerges blind and hairless and climbs unaided to its mother's pouch through sheer instinct alone. That journey, just centimeters long and yet one of the most remarkable feats of newborn survival in the animal kingdom, says everything about the resilience quietly encoded into Australian wildlife. Spend any time in the Australian bush and kangaroos become a constant presence. They gather at dusk in the hundreds on Outback stations, their silhouettes filling the golden light like something from a dream. Male red kangaroos can stand nearly 2 meters tall and weigh as much as 90 kilograms. They box. They genuinely box, rearing back on their tails and delivering powerful kicks with those hind legs that can disembowel an opponent. Watching two large males spar in the fading afternoon light, their movements almost choreographed, is one of the most extraordinary wildlife spectacles this country quietly offers. And then there is the koala. Few animals on Earth have captured collective human affection quite so completely. That round face, those tufted ears, those dark liquid eyes, and that absolute, magnificent, almost philosophical dedication to rest. Koalas sleep up to 22 hours a day, a necessity driven by their diet of eucalyptus leaves, which are so low in nutrition and so high in toxins that koalas have evolved an extraordinarily slow metabolism to process them. They are, in a sense, fueled by poison, and they make it look effortless. Encounter a koala in the wild, perhaps clinging to a roadside gum tree in South Australia or dozing in the spotted gums of Queensland's hinterland, and time simply stops. The world, for a moment, becomes nothing more than that small gray animal and the quiet certainty that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. But if any single creature captures the spirit of Australian wildlife's extraordinary uniqueness, it is the platypus. When a dried specimen was first sent to Britain in 1799, the naturalist George Shaw suspected a hoax. He reportedly took scissors to the bill, looking for the stitches. There were none. The platypus is real, magnificently real, a semi-aquatic mammal that lays eggs, nurses its young on milk secreted through patches of skin rather than nipples, navigates underwater using electroreception to detect the electrical fields of its prey, and delivers venom through spurs on its hind legs. It is, by any measure, an animal that seems assembled from spare parts and yet moves through a clear mountain creek with an elegance that is quietly stunning. Find them in the cool rivers of eastern Australia at dawn, and you will understand why early naturalists struggled to believe their own eyes. The wombat deserves its own moment of recognition. Stocky, powerful, and possessed of a skull so thick it can withstand the weight of a predator pressing down on it in a burrow, the common wombat is a creature of deceptive depth. They are the architects of the Australian grasslands, their extensive burrow networks providing shelter for dozens of other species. And in perhaps the most gleefully unexpected fact in all of Australian natural history, the wombat produces cube-shaped droppings, the only animal known to do so. Scientists only recently worked out how, discovering that the last sections of the wombat's intestine have varying elasticity that shapes the waste into neat geometric parcels. Australia continues, even now, to produce biological surprises. Move north into the tropical rainforests of far north Queensland and the wildlife takes on a more prehistoric character. The cassowary stands nearly 2 meters tall, wears a brilliant blue and red neck like a jewel, and carries a dagger-like claw on each foot capable of delivering a devastating kick. This is a bird that looks like it walked out of the Cretaceous period, and in a sense it did, a ratite bird whose lineage stretches back to a time before Australia separated from Antarctica. They are also, remarkably, keystone species of the daintree, swallowing large fruits whole and dispersing seeds throughout the forest. Without the cassowary, the ancient daintree rainforest would slowly impoverish itself. Beauty and ecological necessity, perfectly combined. In the top end, the apex predator is undeniable. The saltwater crocodile, the largest living reptile on Earth, inhabits the rivers, estuaries, and coastlines of northern Australia with a stillness that is more unnerving than any display of aggression. They can exceed 6 meters in length and weigh over 1,000 kilograms. They have been patrolling these same waterways for over 200 million years, surviving every extinction event that has erased so much else from this planet's surface. Watching one from the safety of a boat on the Adelaide River near Darwin, utterly motionless, ancient, and patient, you understand viscerally that you are in the presence of something that genuinely does not regard you as the most important thing in the landscape. And yet for all these dramatic encounters, it is sometimes the quieter wildlife moments that lodge deepest. Standing in a Victorian mountain ash forest at first light, listening to a superb lyrebird perform its extraordinary mimicry, weaving chainsaw sounds and camera shutters and kookaburra calls into a cascade of sound so perfect and so strange it raises the hair on your arms. This is a bird that has absorbed the sounds of an entire landscape into itself and plays them back like a living archive of the forest. It is at once the most Australian of sounds and a reminder that this continent's wildlife is still actively surprising us, still revealing new layers, still insisting, with remarkable persistence, that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we had thought. From the dingo that arrived with human travelers thousands of years ago and became woven into the very fabric of the Outback, to the quokka on Rottnest Island off the coast of Perth, whose apparent smile made it briefly the most photographed animal on the internet, Australian wildlife finds ways to astonish at every turn. And woven through all of it, inseparable from the landscape and the creatures that inhabit it, is the deep cultural knowledge of the people who have lived alongside these animals for 60,000 years, who understood their behaviors, tracked their movements, and incorporated them into story and ceremony long before the first naturalist ever raised a skeptical pair of scissors. That connection between people and land, ancient and alive and layered with meaning, is itself one of Australia's most extraordinary wonders. 60,000 years. Let that number settle for a moment. When the ancestors of today's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples first set foot on this continent, the pyramids of Egypt were still 40,000 years away from being built. The Roman Empire had not yet been imagined. Every single civilization that we commonly study in school, every dynasty, every empire, every great city of the ancient world, would fit inside the most recent fraction of Australia's human story. This is not merely the oldest continuous culture on Earth. It is older than anything else we know of by such a staggering margin that the mind genuinely struggles to hold the full weight of it. And what has survived across that immense span of time is extraordinary. Language, for one. At the time of European arrival in 1788, linguists now estimate that somewhere between 250 and 300 distinct Aboriginal language groups existed across the continent, each with its own grammar, vocabulary, and regional variations. Today, around 120 of those languages are still spoken, and dedicated communities are working tirelessly to revive and preserve many more. Each language carries within it a unique way of perceiving the world, a distinct set of categories for understanding time, space, kinship, and country. When a language disappears, it is not simply a communication tool that is lost. It is an entire architecture of human thought, irreplaceable and irretrievable. The dreaming, or the dreamtime, is one of the most misunderstood concepts that outsiders encounter when first learning about Aboriginal culture. It is not a historical period that ended. It is not mythology in the way that Greek or Norse mythology tends to be understood in the Western tradition. The dreaming is an ever-present reality, a framework in which the spiritual, the physical, the ancestral, and the contemporary all exist simultaneously. Creation stories are not relegated to the distant past. They are alive in the landscape right now, encoded in rock formations, in the paths of rivers, in the movements of animals, in the patterns of stars overhead. To walk across country, as Aboriginal Australians describe their traditional homelands, is to walk through a living narrative of creation. Australia holds some of the most significant rock art sites on the planet. The Marujaga rock art of the Pilbara region in Western Australia is believed to include engravings up to 50,000 years old, making it potentially the oldest known rock art in the world. At Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory, layers of paintings span thousands of years of continuous artistic practice, with some works depicting animals that are now extinct, including the thylacine and the Tasmanian tiger, which vanished from the mainland long before European contact. These images are not decorations. They are documents, ceremonies, records, and sacred communications stretched across stone across unimaginable time. European settlement began in January of 1788 when the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove, carrying over 1,000 people, roughly 750 of them convicts transported from Britain. What followed was a chapter of history marked by profound hardship and moral complexity. The British colony that grew from those first tents and timber shelters would eventually reshape the entire continent. Yet the story of that reshaping is inseparable from the dispossession, violence, and devastation visited upon the people who already called Australia home. The smallpox epidemic that swept through Aboriginal populations near Sydney within months of the first fleet's arrival killed a staggering proportion of the local people. It was the beginning of demographic catastrophe that would unfold across the continent over the following century. Australia's colonial history unfolded with remarkable speed. By the time of Federation in 1901, when the 6 separate British colonies united to form the Commonwealth of Australia, the continent had already experienced a gold rush that transformed its population almost overnight. The Victorian gold rush of the 1850s drew fortune seekers from China, Ireland, the United States, Germany, and dozens of other nations, creating a multicultural population in the goldfields that the colony's establishment could barely have imagined. Melbourne grew so rapidly on the wealth of gold that by the 1880s it was one of the wealthiest cities in the world per capita, its grand Victorian boulevards and ornate public buildings earning it the nickname Marvellous Melbourne. The gold rush also gave birth to one of Australia's most cherished moments of democratic defiance. At the Eureka Stockade in Ballarat in 1854, miners who had grown furious at the injustice of expensive mining licenses and oppressive colonial policing raised a flag bearing the Southern Cross and staged an armed uprising. The rebellion was crushed in minutes, but the symbolic power of the Eureka flag endured. It became a rallying image for workers' rights, democratic reform, and Australian identity in ways that echo down to the present day. The Southern Cross itself, visible on the Australian national flag, remains one of the most emotionally resonant symbols for Australians across the political spectrum. Modern Australia is one of the most culturally diverse nations on Earth. Today, nearly a third of Australia's population was born overseas, and almost half of all Australians have at least one parent born in another country. Waves of immigration following World War II, including large arrivals from Greece, Italy, Lebanon, Vietnam, China, India, and dozens of other nations, have made Australian cities into genuinely cosmopolitan places. Melbourne in particular is said to have the largest Greek-born population of any city outside Greece itself. Sydney's Chinatown dates back to the 1800s. The food, the music, the languages overheard on any given street corner in a major Australian city reflect the world. And then there are the facts that defy easy categorization, the pieces of Australian reality that seem designed purely to delight and bewilder. Australia is the only country in the world that governs an entire continent. It is home to the longest network of fences on Earth, including the Dingo Fence, which stretches nearly 5,600 kilometers across southeastern Australia and was built to protect sheep farming regions from wild dingo populations. The fence is so long that the climate on one side noticeably differs from the climate on the other, because the grazing patterns of kangaroos and other animals are entirely different in areas where dingoes are absent. Australia was the first country in the world to introduce polymer banknotes, those flexible, translucent, nearly indestructible notes that are now used by dozens of countries globally. It was also the first country in the world to give women both the right to vote and the right to stand for parliament at the federal level, in 1902. That same year, however, the same act excluded Aboriginal Australians and many people of Asian descent from those rights, a contradiction that sits uncomfortably at the heart of the early Federation story. The full recognition of Aboriginal Australians in the national census did not come until 1967, when a national referendum passed with over 90% support, one of the highest approval margins of any referendum in Australian history. There is something in the Australian character, forged from all of this, from ancient connection to land and the upheavals of colonization, from gold rush fortunes and working-class solidarity, from the immensity of the landscape and the fragility of life within it, that produces a particular kind of resilience. A dark humor. A fierce egalitarianism. A deep suspicion of pretension. Australians call it the tall poppy syndrome, the cultural tendency to cut down those who rise too high above their peers, and while it has its limitations, it also reflects something genuine in the national spirit. Nobody here is too important to share a beer, to make fun of themselves, to acknowledge the strangeness and the luck of living in this particular place at this particular moment in history. And that coastline, that impossibly long, breathtakingly varied coastline that frames all of this history and culture in life, calls us outward once more. Thank you for watching the video till the end. If you like the content, please do like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps us improve.